Hello and welcome to another of Kirov's classical music podcasts. My guest today is the founder and owner of one of the area's most prestigious premier string instrument shops, Potter Violins. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dalton Potter onto the Kirov podcast. Welcome.
Wow, thank you for having me. This is truly an honor here.
Well,
See you.
as far as it being an honor, I'm not sure, to whom the honor is. It is really a privilege to talk to somebody who is as much of a sort of community linchpin as you are and as your shop is. Um, I actually definitely want to talk about that. The role of well, your vision of your role within the community and the shop's role within the community. Um, but I wanted to even start the way that I often do with guests to sort of explain the target viewer for whom you are for whom you are appearing and whom I would like you to sort of inform. The target viewer is the student and or the student's parents who is involved in matters musical but not deeply. That is to say, someone might be planning even to be a professional musician, but their parents may not know very much about the musical world. Also, someone may not be planning to be a professional musician, but is serious enough to invest in private lessons, to have a sort of second major, you might say, in music. And for people like that, very often they don't know what they don't know. They don't know what questions to ask. They don't know where the gaps in their knowledge might be, and that is where we come in, right? So, for those kind of parents, where I wanted to start talking to you is when it comes to the matter of equipment. Um, what would you tell um, the mom or dad of a kid who wants to take cello lessons, violin lessons, and is wondering whether to rent or buy an instrument?
Okay. Yeah. Well, first, the first thing I would say is I think that it's a wonderful decision on the part of parents to have their children study music. Just that opening to begin with is something that I want to commend them on. There's lots of activities that youngsters can become involved in, and many of them are very helpful and good. I don't want to discount them, but I believe that music is one of the few areas of educational activity and development that has as much potential as it does. There's very few that you use both. So with music, you're using both the language center in your brain and also the what they call the abstract center. You're using both of those at the same time. The brain works together on those. And so what they've discovered is that, and I'm going to get a little wonky on you for just a second, but it's kind of interesting. And those of us who have young children know suddenly they come up with things that we didn't teach them, that they've put together information in their little heads at 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever years old they are, and things come out of their mouth, and you go,
Where did that come from?
Right. And what that is, that's the brain literally making new connections inside your brain. There's new connections being made every day and cemented in place. Those new connections happen because of experience. So the experiences that your youngsters have, whether it's watching television or kicking a soccer ball or playing a violin, basically become permanent wiring inside the brain over time. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that experiences that are had while they're developing like this are something that are going to leave them with positive traits and skills that they can put to use later on to help them survive. Because, I mean, basically most parents that I know, they want their kids to grow up and have at least a good life as they have and maybe better. And they want them to, go further than them. So at the end of the day, basically just deciding that you're going to have your youngsters involved in music that's number one. There's no downside to it. I could get real scientific on it, but I won't because that gets boring.
Well,
Um,
actually, I don't think it gets boring, but what you were saying about the two halves of the brain, I managed to impress the technicians when my wife was pregnant, who were doing the weekly. I forget. I always get confused with MRI versus CAT scans. I think these were MRIs. And at one point, somebody mentioned something about our uh, growing children's brain situation. And I mentioned something about the corpus callosum, the material joining the two hemispheres of the brain,
correct.
having been shown to be thicker in musicians.
Yes.
And the doctors were somewhat impressed that, first of all, I knew what the corpus callosum was, and secondly, that I had read the study that they had not heard of.
Right.
I'm not going to pretend the study was revealing a causal relationship. If you practice an instrument, your brain will grow. I'm not going to say that. Maybe it is because your brain has grown, you play an instrument. But they
Yeah.
are connected.
Which came first, right?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Exactly.
So, but I will tell you just, and this is so this is the Princeton study. Um, when you're born, the amount of gray matter versus white matter in your brain, the kind of cells and how they're differentiated, the white matter is a much higher percentage. It's about 10 or 12%. When we get to be a grown adult, that's maybe 3%. So, how those little neurons connect to each other happens over a period of the first 8 to 10 years of your life, but mostly in the earlier stages. So, one of the things that we find happening is that we'll have somebody come in that they've decided they want their youngster to study music, and they go, okay, well, I just want to get, the cheapest thing I can possibly get. And then later on, when they have practiced a lot and they show that they're really inspired, they're going to be good. We're going to get them a great violin. And the answer that I have for them always takes them by surprise. And my answer is, no, you need to get them the great violin first. And if you can't afford a great violin when they're grown up, that's okay, because they can still make music with it. But the fact is that the equipment that you use while you're developing is crucial to even being able to develop. And what we see happening is that people will hit a ceiling in their playing development, in their understanding of music, and they don't know that they're doing it. As you said, they don't know what they don't know. And so well, you don't have to spend a fortune. You don't have to get crazy. You have to do enough. And so generally what I do is the first thing I do is I tell the parents that there's two rules. The first one is ask your teacher. Second one is don't be cheap. Now, it's easy for me to say that second one because it's scary and people go, oh, wow, what's he mean by that? The answer is, if your teacher, you trust your teacher, this is the person that your little son or daughter is going to at least once a week, that you're expecting them to practice every day and to help improve your youngster. If this person is a person you trust with the development of your child, then you need to trust them when they give you advice. So when they say, go find a nice violin to rent or go buy a violin at this price, you don't go, oh, I'm going to go on the internet and find a way to get around that advice. You go, yes, sir, that's what I'll do. Because your teacher's not going to tell you to buy something for your son or daughter that they don't need, because it's a waste, and they don't want to see you be frustrated, and they don't want to see your child be frustrated. But there are certain minimums that just like with sporting equipment, if you've got a tennis racket and it's not balanced, if you have ice skates that aren't sharp and they won't let you glide, just like those types of situations, when it comes to musical equipment, it has to be of a minimum certain level in order to allow the student to progress.
I I cannot endorse that strongly enough. I my usual example that I give to parents is that when your child begins driving lessons, you don't want them learning to drive in your brand new Lamborghini. I mean, maybe if you're Jeff Bezos and
Maybe you got a Lamborghini. I don't have one yet.
but again, the beginner driver is not going to benefit from something that is designed for an experienced and even skilled driver.
Right.
So you don't want your kid driving something hugely expensive. On the other hand, you don't want your kid driving something that steers unpredictably or is liable to break down in the left lane of the highway, right? So you want, as you just said, you want equipment that is not going to hinder them, And it is it is a good question whether that minimum, that bare minimum, is a rental or a purchase. The instruments that I have seen at Potter Violins that are rentals are excellent instruments for a beginner. That they are not the car that breaks down in the left lane of the highway. But I sometimes get parents coming to me. I won't mention any chains, but I'm sure you and I are thinking of the same names. Parents coming who have gotten an instrument on the cheap, whether it's on, God help us, eBay, or some strip mall shop that sells tubas and, oh, by the way, violins also.
Yeah.
I call them VSOs, violin shaped objects.
It happens too frequently, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And what do you say to the parent who comes in and says, "Oh, I
Well,
rented or bought this thing"?
I have a solution for that one. And usually, I hate to say this because people will think that I'm being discriminatory, but generally it's the dads that do this. Mom comes home and says, "We need to get a violin. Little Sally's going to be studying with Mr. Chudnovsky, and he's going to be Tarzan, and he's going to go out there and he's going to kill this problem. He's going to find the best
Hunt that,
right,
hunt that
without
mouse.
doing anything." So, um, but I do have a solution, and I've shared this before. I don't usually share it publicly, but it's partially amusing, but it's partially useful, and that is, so when a mom and dad show up and they've got a youngster and they've got one of these violins that came from eBay, and unfortunately, when they come to my shop, they usually find out that they're going to spend 2 to 3 times the cost that they spent. Let's say they spent 150 on the violin with a case and bow. In order to make the bow play and the strings play and the bridge work, they're going to spend that money twice over. So I don't recommend that. But when they do, I have a solution, and that is, oh, Mr. and Mrs.
Smith.
Miss Smith, that's wonderful. We're so excited that you're helping your son or daughter learn how to play violin. That's great. Aren't you wonderful for going out and finding the right thing? Now you have a violin that you can leave at school, and we can get a good violin for them to practice on at home.
And that is not, for the parents, I have to leap in and point out that is not manipulation or sneakiness. If your child is playing in a school orchestra, I have seen horror stories. I try to impress upon my students, never open a case when it's lying on the floor, right? The same goes for cellists, obviously, violists, because kids are running around, etc. But even without opening violin and cello cases when they're lying on the ground where careless feet can stomp an instrument into splinters, I've heard horror stories about kids carving their names into the backs of school rented instruments. I've heard kids, getting into uh, joking fights and knocking. There was a very fine young violinist in the area whose parents had just invested in a real professional instrument, a $30,000 instrument. Somebody at school jokingly knocked into him, knocked the case off his shoulder. The case hit the ground. The instrument got a $5,000 crack on the top plate on the table. So definitely to go to school, I would strongly endorse Mr. Potter's prescription of take the cheapo instruments.
Have a second instrument.
Yes.
There you go. There you go. But
Uh,
but the point being that if you don't know what you're doing, don't go shopping for an instrument right out of the gate. Or if you're going to do that, everything comes back to rule number 1, which is ask your teacher. So what would happen is this person that you found wants to sell you this violin, and you say, "Well, that's great. I really need to show this to Emil Chudnovsky before we finalize this deal. So is it okay if I take this and show it to him? Don't cash my check. And if he approves it, then we're good." That's one way of sort of having it both ways. What It's interesting, Emil, because when I first started the shop and I was trying to figure out how we would handle servicing both professional and student level instruments, and there's a lot of shops that will only do one or the other. They won't do both. But I see it as a continuum where students are starting here, they're going there, they get better and they get better, and then finally they become professionals. Some of them don't. But I was getting a lot of complaints from teachers just like you who would have their student come back from the store where there was a kid with green hair and a bone through his nose that played drums, that gave them a violin, and they didn't know what to do about it. And so the end result was about 20 years ago, we actually put out a questionnaire and we said, what kind of things would you like in your, if you had the ideal rental program, if you as a teacher could design the ideal rental program, what would it look like? And we got about, I'm going to say, almost 300 responses. We boiled them down to the most important 8 or 10 points. And for us, this isn't designed to be an advertisement for my shop. I want to say this directly. There are plenty of good shops around the country. And if you don't happen to live in the Washington area, or if you live here and you don't find that Potter's is convenient for you, I'm just giving you standards that you should expect when you're renting an instrument. Number one, you should be able to exchange it. You should be able to accumulate a certain amount of credit while you're renting it. For us, it's 18 months, so that you can literally rent an instrument from us for a year and a half. And then if you decide to buy something, all that rent is sitting in a little pot waiting for you to use it. And it can help you defray the cost of buying your first instrument, because I'm going to guarantee you, for a youngster that's 6 or 7 years old, when you find out that you have to buy, in order to get a decent instrument where you're going to buy one, you have to spend $600, $800, maybe $1,000 for a little 5-year-old. Most parents are going to go, no, I'm not doing that. That's crazy. Well, the answer is, otherwise, they're going to practice and not make progress. So it's easier to rent an $800 violin for $25 a month, which is what we do. And then you know that they'll be able to at least not be impaired in their ability to learn the skill.
You have the best of both worlds.
There's also, you can always go into the shop and say, oh, my teacher says the E string's wrong, or the bow is wrong, or something. And you have somebody to come and interact with and help fix things and make sure they work right. But so if you have those standards and you apply them to whatever shop you go to, then you're pretty much going to be okay. And then most shops will also take instruments back. Once you've graduated out of renting an instrument, most shops will have a process whereby you trade in your old instrument. So you might buy a half size, and then when 2 years later, you go get a 3/4. Most of the investment that you have in the half size will come back to you as an equity towards the next instrument. It's very standard.
And I would say that the one thing you haven't mentioned is that at Potter's, at the shops where I can direct my students with, peace of mind, the people with whom my students will be working to choose an instrument, whether it's to buy or to rent, the people who are going to be doing setup, etc., are specialists. Some of these strip mall kind of places, etc., I have horror stories. This is more for your amusement than for our listeners, but maybe they'll be amused anyway. I was doing a festival in Brazil a few years ago, and on a day off, I wandered in with the director who had invited me to be on the faculty. I wandered into a local music shop where they sold sheet music and instruments. And while I was there doing sort of, spelunking into the archives of the sheet music, a lady came in and said that the violin that she had gotten wouldn't play. And she opened the case, and Dalton, the strings of the violin went through the eyes of the bridge. They went through the bridge. Which, for the parents who are watching this and don't know what I just said, essentially she had shown a bicycle with 2 flat tires and no pedals and said, I can't seem to ride this thing. So when
if you could, that would be a feat.
That would be a feat. But when you are hiring, 4 potters, obviously the people who are working in the workshop you hire based on their expertise, based on their knowledge of violin, building, and so on. But more than once, I have encountered the people that you hire being capable players, who are more than able to say, oh, you know what, this instrument that you've just brought in from the strip mall, the reason it won't play is, and they can demonstrate.
Right. No, I make a point in the workshop. Many presidents of companies spend their days behind a desk looking at papers or computers or something. I have been gifted with a wonderful staff that allows me to spend most of my time in my workshop and really working with my staff. And one of the rules, the very first rule that you have is you have to play everything you set up. I don't care if you can only play a G scale, you have to play it, and you have to play every single thing. And the reason is that you have to be able to develop that ability to differentiate between, whether something's set up correctly or not. And while it comes as a shock to some folks, the fact is that many of the people who work for me have either could be or have been in the past professional musicians,
and in some cases
being in a
currently
store,
are.
as a way of earning a living. I think most musicians have a plan B, and happy to be that for some folks. You're freezing up on me, by the way.
Yeah, sorry, you were as well. I was about to send a quick text SOS. By the way, while we're talking about tech issues, I should point out that today we are starting a new feature of these classical chats, which is that rather than keeping the question and answer segment to the very end of the podcast, the floor is open to questions throughout the podcast. So if anyone watching this has any questions, please feel free to post it in the comments. We will see it and we will address your question, presuming that it's not something outside our purview. Right now, am I still freezing? Are you? Well, let me send that SOS.
You're freezing for me, but
some glitches. Help.
But I will say, while you're taking a break, what an amazing world we have, that inside of essentially a year, we've gone from this being sort of an odd thing that people talked about to being daily life. Now, sometimes it's too much daily life, but
I'm trying to imagine what it will be like to go back to lessons. I'm trying to imagine what it will be like to go back to lessons in person, rehearsals in person. That is now going to feel like foreign stuff. I wanted to ask you still one aspect of fine instruments that we haven't discussed. We've been talking about the entry level, the student deciding that they want to begin. Let's talk a little bit about the higher end, and specifically about the student about to go off to college, potentially to conservatory. Probably by the time that someone is auditioning for Juilliard, they know their way around many aspects of the musical world, but their parents still might not.
Right.
So what is your advice like to parents of a child about to go off to their first international competition?
Right. Okay, so what I'm going to say, and I may, if I overstep, you let me know, but I'm going to say that it's my experience that the students that come out of your studio are, on a scale of 1 to 10 for students, you sort of start at a 6.5 or a 7 and go up. You don't have the
Well, I get those. I just they don't stay there.
So if we're talking about, okay, parents, you've discovered that you have a youngster that has talent and is willing to work, and that's an important part of it. And you are trying to figure out, okay, we're supposed to send them to college, we're supposed to pay for tuition, and they need an instrument in order to be able to do this. How do we get this all to happen correctly? My answer is, first off, understand that there are different levels of professional studies. So there are people who are going to go into music, say at the University of Maryland, which is very hard to get into. But their goal really is not to try and be Hillary Hahn. It's to be maybe a music teacher or, a local professional where they teach and they play. So I'm going to take that group first, and that is going into a non-Eastman, non-Juilliard, non-Curtis, level conservatory, not one of the top tier. At a bare minimum, you should be looking at a violin in the $10,000 to $15,000 range. If you don't have it when you walk in the door, you will be encouraged within the first year that you're going to have to do that at least or more. 20 would be not uncommon. You'll need to have a bow that's at least 25 to 30% of the value of that instrument. So if you aren't hearing me correctly, or if you're falling over and picking yourself up right now, um, if you buy a $15,000 violin, you need to be looking at a $5,000 bow to go with it. And here's
And
the
by the way, for the people who are falling over, let's put that into context. How much are you spending on a used car?
right,
I know what
right,
I know what I paid for my Toyota Avalon when it was all of, I think, 6 or 7 years old.
yeah, yeah. So, so these instruments can be antique instruments, they can be new instruments, but the rule number one is, you're all screaming at your thing. Rule number one is check with your teacher before you commit. Make sure that they're part of your decision making process. The other thing that is kind of interesting is that bows actually are more important than violins. So the violin is essentially just an amplifier. It takes a small sound and makes it into a big sound. The bow is what actually you play music with. It's what starts and stops the notes. It's what allows you to play quickly or slowly, have a very soulful long note. All of that is the bow. And so it's really, really critical, especially again, you work with your teacher to make sure that you get the right bow, because it's not a matter of how much are you spending, it's a matter of what are you getting that's correct.
Yeah,
And every
we should
there are
point
ways.
out that with bows,
Yeah,
there is, and with violins also, there is also the phenomenon of the player's bow, the player's violin, an item which perhaps has suffered some damage that has been expertly repaired, um, which damage may devalue the object and make it difficult to resell. But meanwhile, you still have something that plays at a much higher level than its price would suggest.
but it's important to have somebody who plays better than you help you to determine whether you have something that'll take you from here to there. Now I see a question on the screen here from
Which is
Sarah.
a really relevant one since we're
Yes,
talking
and this is
dollars and
one of
cents.
my favorites. So the answer is there are all kinds of programs available, generally through public schools, for strings programs, and you have to support them. So if you support the string programs, we will help you support them. Generally, when it comes to music education, it starts with school programs and then trickles over to private studios like Emil's. There are, of course, I know that the Kirov has programs. You'll have to address that because we're talking about Kirov today, for under, you know, resourced players who need to have access and be able to study music at a professional level, at a higher level than just, you know, once a week at the local middle school. And as far as Potters is concerned, we do have a program. It's not well publicized, but for advanced players that have not yet earned the position that would allow them to own, say, a 20 or a 30 or a $50,000 violin. There are instruments that we have in a loan program that can be it can be arranged for people to be able to have access to them for
Do
their.
you have an audition process for that?
Yes, we do. And for in our case, basically what it is these are instruments where the owners no longer have use for them. Their family members are not playing them, but they want the instruments to be played. They want them to be used. And so what we do is we arrange for the recipient of these instruments. They would have to sign a very strong legal agreement that they're going to cover the insurance costs of having the instrument in their possession, and they have to re-up it every year, and they have to show proof of that. But basically, that's a wonderful, wonderful way for both the owners to participate in supporting these young people who need help, and the young people to, you know, start making connections with the music world, and also having access to an instrument that they might otherwise never have been able to touch.
Now, I would just add to that that the number of institutions, youth orchestras, schools, etc., that have some form of scholarship available, it's a pretty high number. It's more difficult for a private studio like mine to have a designated scholarship program, but very often a studio like mine will be able to put you in touch with a program that may either offer some sort of a subsidy towards musical education, or, as Mr. Potter's been saying, a loan program for an instrument that may be out of your financial reach. I should also point out that even at the highest level, at least in the violin world and the cello world and the viola world, not quite the same necessarily for pianists. Um, in our world, the A level performers may not own their A level instruments because the A level instruments for violins, for cellos, are in the not 6 digit, not 7 digit now, but 8 digit range. There are not just one or two, but many instruments that go for above $10 million. Bows that exceed $300,000. Um, if you are hearing some famous performer play on an instrument and you look at the fine print in the concert program, you will often see that so and so plays on such and such a Strad or Del Gesù, courtesy of the blankety blank foundation.
Right.
The foundation or the individual may retain ownership of the instrument, but the performer gets extended use of it. The instrument on which I currently play does not belong to me. It belongs to a friend of mine who bought it for investment purposes and loaned it to me so that the instrument gets played and gets exposure.
Right. Yeah. So for what it's worth, we're actually looking at starting a nonprofit foundation specifically for that purpose. There are many of them out there. We would just be one of several, but we found that the need is becoming more frequent, and there are plenty of owners out there who have instruments that aren't going to play them. That as long as they know the instrument is safe, their investment is protected, that they're willing to allow them to be used by qualified individuals. And the music world is one of those ones where it's you have to earn your seat.
Oh, yeah. Speaking of that, a former student of mine doing the audition circuit now has on more than one occasion complained that the instrument that he bought that was, his dream instrument when he was 14, 15 and didn't know what he was doing, that instrument is now a serious liability. So
Wow.
when he is in a competitive situation doing an
Yeah.
orchestra audition and there are 200 applicants for the same spot, and it comes down to two people who are equally good, but one is a skilled driver driving a Toyota and the other is a skilled driver driving a Formula One car. Who do you think gets the spot?
Yeah. Yeah.
So for somebody like that to have to come up initially with the money to buy an instrument with which they could then win an audition, it's a catch-22. They can't get the audition until they have the instrument. They can't get the instrument until they have the audition.
Right. So I don't want to leave our friends in the dust that are just have 5 and 6 year olds that they're trying to first get involved in music, which is where we started to begin with. But I want to make sure that they understand, there's a certain percentage of kids that, and I used to run a music school. I guess I told you that before. And one of the things I discovered, there's lots of kids with talent. There's only so many kids with talent who can be inspired to work hard, because if you don't work hard, it doesn't matter how much talent you have. So the whole idea of applying yourself with regularity is so critical. Having a teacher that inspires your youngster and makes them want to go back. I don't want to wait a week to get back to my lesson. I want to come now because they've been working on things and they want to please their teacher. That's so critical. But at the end of the day, even with the most talent and hard work, having the correct tools or not having the correct tools can actually put a stop to everything. And not everybody's going to grow up to become a musician,
Well,
a
that's
professional, and that's okay, because you
that's
don't.
one of the things that I sort of have to um, not struggle against, but contend with on a very frequent basis. The parents who say, I'm not a musician, therefore, my child shouldn't be taking music lessons, or I don't want my child to become a professional musician, so therefore we don't need private instruction. Um, I try to combat
Make
these
mistakes.
misperceptions with reminding people that there are many fulfilling things that you can do with music
Right.
besides becoming a professional performing musician.
Yeah, no,
As you mentioned,
and
teaching, there's freelancing, but there's also in any given big city, there's going to be at least one doctor's orchestra. at
Yeah.
least one lawyer's orchestra.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say that when our shop was a few miles west of where we are now, over in Bethesda, our happiest, I remember it very clearly that the clientele that seemed to be amazing, I mean, incredible players, right? They could play at a professional level. They were all from the NIH orchestra. They were
Mm-hmm.
research scientists and engineers and what I like affectionately called lab rats, because my whole family's full of them. I'm the only one who's not actually in the academics. But the fact is that studying music adds to the brain's ability to process numbers. It adds to the brain's ability to understand languages. There are social interactions and social skills that become very critical to being able to work in an orchestra with other people. So there's really no downside to this, even
And
if you don't think your daughter or son is going to be a professional musician. And I
and
give
they
you
should.
one little warning, and that is, if they're really one of those kids that's like a Hillary Hahn or an Emil Chudnovsky, you're not going to stop them. You're done.
This was something that we were talking about with Professor Boris Slitsky last week. Where the question was, what would you say to someone considering going into music? And the upshot was that if you can do something else, you should. You should do music professionally if you can't live without it, if you can't imagine doing anything else. But those lab rats that you mentioned, these are people who, presumably in high school, they were going to weekly lessons, maybe even twice weekly lessons. They were the people who probably double majored or majored in, something pre-med while doing a music minor. They were people who were advanced as youngsters and opted to go into a field that was either equally interesting or perhaps a little bit less dicey than people perceive music to be. But I want to talk a little bit about that, about perception and misperception. The notion of the starving musician is, I think, a misperception. It's the musical field is not an impoverished one. There are billions of dollars at play. Um, what sorts of misconceptions have you encountered from parents? Like one of them is this: either I've got to be a professional or I shouldn't do it at all, which false. What else?
Wow, boy, you just hit it on the head. I have a wonderful friend I haven't seen in many, many years. I will admit that, but he's I met him back in the '90s, named Brad Blanton. Now, Brad is a psychotherapist, and he's also an author. He's written a number of books, but the book that I liked the best was something called Radical Honesty. And his thesis was people run around the world kind of lying to themselves, and then they have to spend so much energy keeping up with the things they've told themselves and told other people that by the time they're 30 years old, they're half psychos because they can't do anything real. So he had a number of sayings that he would bring up that I always used to like, but there's two of them that I would share with you today. One of them directly relates to what you just said. And that is, being a perfectionist, his answer was, if it's worth doing. So many of our parents from the Depression era would say, well, if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing right. Well, no. I'm going to lean forward and say, no. If it's worth doing, it's worth doing at all. So even if you don't succeed the first time, you keep doing it until you get it to the point where you're happy with it. The other one he said was, you can do anything you like in life as long as it's okay for it not to look like you thought it would when you get there. And a lot of times I think we find that we get to a certain stage and we go, wow, I'm doing exactly what I wanted, but I didn't think it was going to be like this. But yeah,
A paraphrase of John Lennon's "Life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans."
right. The things that I've heard that I find destructive really circle back to the whole idea that I don't want to invest in an instrument until my son or daughter is at an advanced level. And once again, I'm going to say, you have to remember that you're not investing in an instrument; you're investing in a child.
Vital point. Yes.
Yeah, you're not investing in the instrument; you're investing in a child. And how far that child's going to go in life will also depend upon how much you demonstrate that you believe in them. All this stuff where we say, honey, I love you, I believe in you, I think you're the best. Somewhere along the line, you have to live up to that. Ooh. Ouch.
Yeah. Well, there's, I believe in you. I think you're the best. But perhaps, given that you are 5'2", the NBA may not be in your future. There are, and I've said this to parents too. There are things that will happen that you cannot foresee. Your child is dedicated to ballet, but sprouts to be 6'6". And all of a sudden, you're talking about them having a really uphill battle with the ballet world. Your child dreams of being an NBA player, but their height doesn't catch up. There are the unforeseeables. With music, there aren't that many. I mean, short of having your hand chopped off. I mean, I don't know if you noticed this. This was the day before yesterday. I cut the end of my finger off.
Oh, I can finish it here.
I could not foresee this, and knock on wood, this will heal, but it does take me out of commission for 10 days. But imagine there are great violinists who have suffered injuries in the kitchen that were basically career ending.
Wow, yeah.
So what do? You do need some broader interest, shall we say.
Yeah.
I think the misconception that I would expect you encounter most often as a violin shop, though, is a really small, sort of focused one, that there is a dollar to quality relationship. That the violin that costs $5,000 is exactly one, fifth as good as an instrument that costs $25,000.
Yeah. Well, there's a relationship, but it's not direct. You're correct about that. One of the other interesting thing is that folks will come in. In fact, I had a person right before we got started, and they had a cello that they'd had since childhood, and they need to have it fixed up. It's been sitting for a long time, and it sounds really awesome. And they want to know, how come, if it sounds better than a $60,000 cello, how come it's not a $60,000 cello? And so there's an intrinsic value that comes from who made the instrument, how old it is, and that kind of thing. And then there's that creates a box. And in that box, something will rise or fall depending upon its condition and the sound it can make. Now, we can work wonders. We can take things that probably will never sound great and turn them into things that do sound great. I don't mind saying that we have a certain skill set that allows us to make instruments sound better than they should for the money that you spend. But there's going to be a correlation. It's not a direct one between, you have to sort of get to certain thresholds, is the way to say it. There are certain thresholds that you have to break. And then within that threshold, you're going to have, so for instance, if you're in a middle school and you've done renting and you need something better, you've got a youngster that's 8 or 10 years old, you should expect to spend, maybe $1,000 to $1,200 on their outfit. If they're really super excited, maybe you'll spend twice that, but you don't have to spend 10. Okay. If you have a high school kid that's playing all the major concertos and is looking at trying to apply to a major music program across the country, yeah, you should be looking at $5,000 to $10,000 on the fiddle and $3,000 on the bow.
I would even say that that's.
Are there ways around? Yeah.
But I would even say
That's
that's
I know.
sort of lowball estimate. If you take a look at most of the people going to, Juilliard, Curtis are the most famous examples.
You're thinking Juilliard and Curtis.
If you're thinking Juilliard, Curtis,
thinking,
the $10,000 violin will not.
No, but there's so few of those. But there are plenty of people who are going to, East Carolina University and places like that, and they're very good players and a good music program, and that's enough for them going out of high school. It won't be enough to finish with.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things that I will mention, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, but you can tell me if you don't. When it comes to when I have a mom and dad and they come in and they say, "Look, Mr. Potter, I just don't have more than a certain amount of money. I'm going to study with Emil, and I've got, $4,500 to get a full size outfit for my kid, and I don't know what to do. And my answer is, I'm going to get you an $1,800 bow or a $2,500 bow, and we're going to find a fiddle that sounds good that doesn't cost a fortune. But that bow is really, really critical. And the interesting thing is that in the world of violins, which is you're having a window into it today, you don't get to see this very often. There are some places in the spectrum of prices where every $100, every $500 makes a difference in sound. I'm going to say between $500 and $1,000, there's a big difference. Between $1,000 and $1,500, there's not that big a difference. Now, but what's interesting is with a bow, the difference between an $800 bow and a $1,600 bow is night and day.
Yes.
So you get more bang for your buck in the bow part of it than you do in the violin part of it.
And I would even go so far as to say that reasoning extends upward in bow prices. If you invest somewhere between $3,000 and $8,000 in a violin, you're still talking about a basic entry-level student instrument. But if you invest that same amount of money in a bow, you will not be laughed at for seeking a professional grade workhorse bow.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So there is one thing I wanted to circle back to, and this is sort of, I don't know how much time we have left.
We've got a little time.
Okay. But it's something that we didn't talk about, and it doesn't really come up that much in the context of, say, you and I talking about these things. But there may be people watching that this is a question for them. I like to think that our political animals in the school systems have our best interests at heart. And I believe that they work very hard to try and do a good job for us. But they have to know what you want as parents. So if you sit at home and complain about how my school doesn't have a music program, did you call them? Did you talk to them? The answer is 90% of the time, no.
Right.
They're giving you what they think you want because you haven't given them the information to know that, yes, we want an orchestra program in our high school. We want an orchestra program in our middle school. We want our students to study music 2 or 3 times a week, not just once every 6 weeks.
We want to bring in teachers for one-on-one lessons.
Right.
Or we want a referral system.
So those of you who are not participating in a private studio with a private teacher at home, you're not out there in the wilderness. You actually have more clout and more resources available to you than many, many, many other parents because you have this massive budget in a school system that really is there to serve you. But you have to be active. You have to choose to help those people understand that music is important as an educational component for your son or daughter's experience going through.
And it doesn't take a major, social upheaval to make them understand.
No,
phone calls from
They just have to hear from them.
They just have to hear from you, right? And they just have to hear from 5 or 6 parents before they say, we're hearing this question recurring. What are we going to do about it? Should we get an orchestra program started, or we've got this orchestra program started? How do we, make it satisfy the parents' requests more thoroughly? And I have to say, the DC area has changed so much since I was a kid and growing up in New York. I had a friend who came up from Alexandria, Virginia, weekly to attend Juilliard pre-college. And for me, as a not born and bred New Yorker, but as a bred New Yorker, the notion that somebody came from Virginia was they might have come from the moon. Virginia was not connected in my mind with anything to do with music. I thought Virginia was like horses, and now the level of playing in this area, the number of youth orchestras in this area. I don't want to mention any because I don't want to forget it.
Somebody out, right?
But the number of youth orchestras, the level of those youth orchestras, the professionalism of Potter violin staff, these were unimaginable 20 years ago, and they are daily truths nowadays. So for parents watching this, no, you're not alone. And yes, you do have resources. And the first of them, as Mr. Potter just said, is your school. I would go so far as to say the second of them is Potter Violins, your local youth orchestra, who will be able to direct you still more specifically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I, I
that's
want
good.
to remind people that, once again, we are open to questions throughout. We're not just going to wait for questions at the end. So feel free to interject if we've breezed by some topic that interests you and you want more information. But while we wait for any such questions, I did want to talk to you about something you and I have discussed
Okay.
many times, and I wish that more people had your viewpoint on. And that is the role of the institution within the community, namely Potter Violins and the local community, Kirov Academy and the local community. Um, I know your position, but could you sort of summarize it for the viewers?
Sure. Well, it's funny. I've been at this for a long enough time so that I can remember times when I was the parent or I was the student trying to find my way. And at the end of the day, we are all successes because somebody else helped us. Somebody else helped us to succeed. So
Amen.
my obligation is I can't succeed unless I make sure that you succeed. And for me, you succeeding means if you're going to study music on an instrument that comes from my shop, it has to be right. It has to be right every time. It can't be right some of the time. And if there's ever a problem or an issue where somebody feels like they're not getting what they need in terms of service or positive reinforcement when they come to my shop, then we aren't doing our job. We want to make it so that your little person wants to play their instrument, that you have to tell them to put it away and go to bed. Not that, oh, this thing really sucks and I hate it and I don't really want to play violin because it sounds terrible. That's not us. So the other thing that we do is we do reach out to the community in terms of helping to support youth programs around the area and music programs in specific. There are so many, people who have come to us where a teacher will say, look, I've got this kid, the family's kind of broken up. They don't know what they're doing. I know from my own experience, because I'm a child of the 60s and 70s, that there were a lot of things that I could be doing in the afternoon that didn't involve staying at school. But if I had a music class, I would stick around. I wouldn't skip school. That was the day I was going to be there the whole day because I wanted to go play music. And what we look at as an institution is we really look at ourselves as being an educational institution with a retail component that's added in.
That's a great way of phrasing it.
Overall, we're trying to make sure that people don't feel like they're at a loss or they're at some disadvantage because of whatever background they have. They don't feel like they know enough, or they don't feel like people in my family never played music, so why should that kind of thing. That's all something we want to try to wipe away, because at the end of the day, if you're able to choose to do a certain activity and you can find friends and support in the community that'll help you to continue and get better, that builds a better community. And because you believe in yourself, people who believe in themselves, they tend to accomplish big things, because when somebody says you're not going to do that, they go, yeah, watch me. Right.
And they don't have to just build that on empty braggadocio. It's based on you've already contended with one of the hardest things that there is, which is playing a musical instrument.
Right. And you take that through your whole life too. That's the other thing, is that not to say anything negative about people who are studying ballet, but there's going to be a time, just like in the NBA or the football, where you're not going to be able to do that anymore. You're going to be a certain level of a certain age level, and your body's just not going to be able to do what a 20-year-old can do. With music, it's something you learn as a younger person, and you play your whole life, and it becomes integral to, it's almost a spiritual quest. It's part of remembering who you really are and why you're on this planet. and how you can help other people. And music is that universal language that we all hear in our heads, and all we're doing is we're trying to make it so that you're lucky enough to be able to have it
I
come through your hands.
I would even go so far as to say that the the role for a community. What does the presence of music do in a community? We're talking about a field where qualities of sensitivity, empathy, communication, interaction are all weapons in your arsenal of success. If you have a community of empathic people, if you have a community of sensitive people, you're not likely to have a community of hostility, antipathy, which is not to say that musicians are always sitting around and singing kumbaya. It's just that you're holding up values in music, which I personally believe, I think, with some justification, I personally believe those values to be constructive ones. You're striving for excellence. You are discovering a work ethic. You are working with other musicians. If you're in a youth orchestra, you're working with other people who share your passion for something that may or may not be a professional thing. Um, and of course, the things that make playing succeed, that make playing communicative. Those qualities are desirable for any member of society. Empathy, sensitivity, aesthetic appreciation. Why
Delayed
would you forego
gratification.
any of that?
Yeah. Being able to start a project and know that it's not going to be done 15 minutes from now. It's not going to be done next weekend. It's not going to be done next month. It's going to be done in June,
Yeah.
and you're going to keep working at it every day, just a little bit in order to be able to be done. And when you do that, your your brain processes information and develops a certain amount of self-respect, because you know what? That's a mountain you wanted to climb. You decided to climb it. You got up, you worked a little bit, you got halfway up, you worked a little bit more, and finally you get to the top. And you can look around and go, you know what? I did this. I decided I was going to do it, and I did this. That kind of self-esteem is something that nobody else can grant you. It comes from the inside. And
I think this is
it's true
where
for every human being on this planet.
this is where both Kirov and Potters have very much the same mission, right?
Yeah.
The societal impact, the local societal impact, as molded by a branch of aesthetics, be it ballet, be it music. Kirov's music department, Kirov's ballet department, Potter's entire business with musical instruments. Um, these are not peripherals that you can tack on and disregard at will. When you disregard them, I think that there is a negative impact to be expected.
Right.
So,
I'm just wondering if anybody that's with us this afternoon, I hope you've been having fun listening to my old friend and I chit chat. But are there any questions that are occurring? I know that one thing I always like to cover is, what do I do? It's wintertime. How do I maintain my instrument? Make sure there's humidity in your house, 30% minimum. Change your bow hair and your strings. And listen
well,
to your teeth.
let's fix that, because I say this to my students and it doesn't do any good. You tell people, please, how often bow hair should be rehaired, how often strings should be replaced.
So we use a rule, and it's 120 playing hours for strings and hair. Now that would be, we're going to start with violin. Strings and hair on a violin, 120 playing hours. That means you play a half hour a day, 5 days a week. You're going to have the bow on the string for 120 hours straight at 6 months. So for people who study with Emil, they probably practice more than a half hour a day. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that means you're going to be
Well,
changing your bow
if
hair
they
and strings
if they
more.
don't, they don't enjoy lessons as much.
The other thing is, cellos are a different thing because their strings are made mostly out of metal strings, and so they last a lot longer. But the bow hair, again, 120 playing hours is if you're playing a half hour a day, it's going to be 6 months. So most people, like our professionals in the National Symphony, I've got folks coming in every 8 weeks to get their hair changed. Sometimes the strings will last longer, but it just depends. And the real rule of thumb is, wow, if you change them and your violin sounds really incredible, it's so much better, and I remember how it sounded good, you waited too long.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, you find that you are your equipment is not reacting the way that you expect it to, that you're used to. Yeah, you might want to look at rotating your tires, so to speak.
Come see us. Five,
A-
four,
Amen.
three.
But let's go to the point that you raised about proper conditions. The
Yeah.
people who store their violin next to a radiator in its case, and then come to you, and the people who store their instrument in a basement that happens to have flooding problems.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what advice are you going to give people about storage?
Well, okay. So number one rule of storage, I do get the question, um, can we leave the violin out? Little Sally likes to play it. If it's out where she can see it, we want to encourage her to play. Well, okay. No, no, no. It needs to go back in the case. And here's what I would tell you, and I'm going to try and get a little closer to the camera. So part of what we're doing here is we're developing an accountability inside the person in their brain for the activity that they've alleged that they love to do. And we know they do love to do it. It's just that there's some parts you like to do more and some parts you like to do less. But one of them has to do with having respect for yourself, having respect for your teacher, and having respect for your instrument. So just like many students will bow to their teacher in the Suzuki method, acknowledging that this teacher is there to share with them, and the teacher bows back, acknowledging they're there to share and that they can learn from the student as well. The silent partner is the violin and the bow. They need to be acknowledged and respected in a way that becomes ritualistic and becomes permanently cemented. And
Reflexive.
learning to care for a physical object is one of the things we want youngsters to learn how to do. So wiping the violin off when you're done, here's my hands, wiping the violin off carefully with a cloth to get the rosin dust off. You put it in the case, you loosen the bow hair so that it's not taut when you put it in the case. And then you put it in the case and you close it and you say, okay, now I'm done and I'm ready to go beat up my little brother or eat bananas or whatever I'm going to do, cereal, kick a soccer ball, whatever you're going to do. But the point is that before you're done, it's not just put the violin on the piano, throw down the bow, and go play with the kitty cat. It's the respect for yourself comes from having respect for other people and other things.
And also as preparation for the day when maybe you will have access to world-class instruments and bows. One of my fond memories, studio recital, this was years ago, 6-7 years ago, a studio recital after which the students and I, well, some students and I went to a local restaurant, and the youngest player, 5 years old at the time, sees all of us standing around in the foyer of the restaurant, many of us with violin cases. She says, "Are we going to be playing here?" I said, "No. I just didn't want to leave the instrument in the car." And she said, "Well, why not?" And I said, "Well, the car might get too hot. It might get too cold. The violin is sensitive. It's a living thing." So this little 5-year-old turned on her heel to her father, and in a commanding voice said, "Car keys," because she had left her keys in the car. And such was the command in the voice that he started reaching for his car keys. I'm like, "You are aware you're about to give your car keys to your 5-year-old daughter so that she goes out into a restaurant's parking lot." He went, "What am I doing?" But the notion of don't leave your instrument in the car. Yeah. Don't leave your instrument where you wouldn't leave your pet.
Yeah. Think of it as a puppy,
Won't hurt.
but it won't wet the carpet.
Uh Maybe your violin is better than mine. I think we have no questions at the moment. Um, you know, I want to keep talking to you forever and a day. It's just that um, I don't want to um, repeat ourselves too much. I don't want to take too much of your time. Um, but to round things out,
Mm-hmm.
as a sort of concluding thought, what I would like to ask of you and of people watching, the advice that you would give to the parent calling their local PTA and asking for, there to be a school orchestra program, the advice that you would give a school when considering what share of their resources to direct, towards matters artistic. If you had all of them lined up in front of you, what would you say to them?
Well, first you have to get their attention. So I don't know I don't know enough about budgets to know what portion in a school budget is discretionary. But the one thing I would want that if I was talking to the bursar or the person who runs accounts inside of a school, whether it's whatever school it is that you need to budget for the orchestra as though it's not discretionary, because it's not. It's one of the most important things, like math and science and chemistry and everything else. So the arts are not discretionary. That's number one. That's what you as parents say. The arts are not discretionary. We're going to do this, whether it's whatever, music and graphic arts are also all important. The other thing, if it's a situation where the school is actually in possession of instruments that are supposed to be used by the students as a resource, be aware that instruments need to be maintained. So for any given instrument, let's say a violin, $300 to $400 a year per instrument is not a crazy thought for 2 sets of strings and 2 brie hairs plus whatever seam might pop open. It's not a crazy thought to have that as a budget going forward to maintain things. Cellos, of course, would be more expensive because the strings are more expensive, and basses again. But it's important to recognize it's not just a one-time flash in the pan type of thing. It's not just, okay, we're going to do this and now we've paid for it and it's done and now okay, that's it. It's an ongoing process. It's like, whatever seasonal issues happen, if you're going to celebrate certain things and you're going to decorate the building or you're going to, have flowers around the building.
And take pride
ongoing.
And take pride in the result of such decoration. And as a city would take pride in its sports team. I remember when Tim Rakanoff first came to Baltimore, the conductor then of the Baltimore Symphony. I remember banners being on telephone poles and lamp posts. And my first thought was, well, of course, because this is the orchestra is the city's sort of aesthetic calling card.
Yeah,
I think it's the same thing for a school.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no shame or sin in being pushy in defense of your kids.
That's a really good point to launch.
Yeah.
Mr. Potter, thank you very, very much for your time. I do very much hope that we can do this again. I also would like to mention to people watching this about your classical open stage program. Do you want to say anything about that?
Okay, sure. So obviously with the worldwide pandemic, the COVID-19 has shut us down for the last year and a half. But prior to when we were back in 2019, we had for 5 years had a program where youngsters could come and have a recital opportunity on camera on live cable television. And the goal was for students between the ages of 8 and 18. So we would take teenagers as well. It wasn't just little toddlers. And they would play at their very best. And my only requirement that I asked the teachers was that they be poised and confident in the performance they're going to give, whether it's Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or the Wieniawski concerto. That whatever it is, they have it down and they have it right. So if you go to YouTube or I think Facebook also, look for Classical Open Stage. And what that is, it's essentially an open mic for little kids to play classical music with strings and piano. I think we had one woodwind player, and that was about the time when we got shut down because there's so many.
It was the woodwind player's fault.
Yeah, there are so many beautiful instruments and so much beautiful music being made and that's written. We just want to see it all, but we hope to see you there.
Once we start returning to a new normal, I very much hope to have new editions of Classical Open Stage. In the meantime, parents, students, please do check out on YouTube, on Facebook. Classical Open Stage has, I'm sure, many archived performances still available for viewing.
Indeed.
Dalton, thank you very much. I
My
truly
pleasure.
appreciate your time. I
It's
hope
an
people
honor.
have learned something.
Yeah. And I hope to see you down. I'd like to go and visit the Kirov sometime when it's okay to be open.
That is in the imminent cards.
Okay. Take
Thank
care
you
then.
so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.